Welcome back to the Grease Goblins Rereads channel. Today's video we're going to be hitting Sansa IV, A Clash of Kings. Now Sansa's a really weird character because it's not a character that we really stick with a lot throughout this book. She has a chapter very early on introducing really the Tyrion plot, and then she has a Dantos introduction plot, and then she has really a reaction to Robb in the West, and we see a little bit of Sansa and Tyrion together. Sansa is really not a prevalent POV in this book, especially when you think about we're a mere couple of chapters from the start of the Battle of the Blackwater, and this is just now her fourth chapter. And so this kind of is going to start the series of chapters where Sansa has a lot of chapters at the very end of this book. More than any other character outside of Tyrion, she is going to become a very prominent POV. So it's a really weird dynamic where I think, for instance, in this book, Catelyn is a very prevalent POV in the middle of this book, but not really in the beginning or the end. It's kind of the same with, Sansa, but in a different way. Whereas she's not really prevalent in the beginning to the middle, she's much more prevalent at the end. So let's start out with Sansa, and I'd really say our first chapter into the Battle of the Blackwater. This is like the prelude. This is like the skirmishes are happening, but it's not exactly the war that's happened yet. Like the Battle of the Blackwater hasn't started yet. But for instance, when I do a video talking about the Battle of the Blackwater, I'm going to begin here because we're going to see the skirmishes happening with Stannis' vanguard, which has arrived at King's Landing, but on the wrong side of the river. And so that'll get us into page 564. The southern sky is black with smoke rising from 100 distant fires and blotting out the stars. Across the Blackwater, a line of flames burns from horizon to horizon. On the city side, Tyrion has set fire to the entire riverfront. Docks, warehouses, homes, brothels, everything outside of the walls is gone. So this is in a lot of ways is a reactionary chapter to what Tyrion did in his last chapter, making sure all of these, houses or markets below the city walls are destroyed, and also sending the mountain clansmen to annoy Stannis, to attack his baggage trains, to attack his rear, to just make Stannis' men a living hell within the wood near King's Landing. And that's the whole purpose of what Tyrion has done. And you're seeing that being reflected now into Sansa's chapter. Even in the Red Keep, the air tastes of ash. Sansa finds her Dantos in the Godswood. He asks if she has been crying. She lies and says it's only the smoke. Sansa, we haven't seen her in a while in terms of being a POV, but she's a character that we can tell has gone through a lot, even off screen. Given when Myrcella, she left King's Landing to go to Dorne, and we saw the whole riot of King's Landing, Sansa was somebody that was deeply impacted by that, especially because she's such a young girl. People were trying to attack her, all of this kind of stuff, and Sansa did nothing to them. And so Sansa's kind of dealing with that. It's a little bit of like that PTSD, that feeling that Sansa has in this chapter. Along with Sansa is also becoming, well, a quote-unquote woman in this society, as she's going to have her first period. Dantos explains Stannis wants to smoke out Tyrion's savages. So more or less Stannis is also playing with fire, right? He's trying to get rid of the ways that the mountain clansmen are able to hide, making it as barren as a field as possible so that this guerrilla warfare can't continue. It's the same idea of, like, say, Vietnam. It's the same idea, like the United States would use fire, more or less, to try and smoke out the Vietnamese. It's the same idea. He adds that the wildlings have also been lighting fires, and that Tyrion mocked Stannis, saying his horses better learn to eat ash since there's no grass left. That's a good point as well. When you think about what Stannis and Tyrion are playing at, it's going to result in a place where there's really nowhere for you to camp at or even to survive. And so it's kind of the opposite of, say, Stannis and Dance with Dragons, where Stannis is dealing with the entire cold, with the deep north. Here it's kind of the opposite, where basically nothing is being left for Stannis' men, any of that kind of stuff. Dantos reflects that as a fool, he overhears much more than he ever did as a knight, since people disregard him. People are not taking Dantos as a threat, and so Dantos is being able to hear privy to conversations by Tyrion, Cersei, maybe the small council. It's the same idea of mushroom and fire and blood, and I very much believe that this chapter heavily influenced where the mushroom character comes from in the Fire and Blood book. So I really liked that nod to it, right? Because when Clash of Kings was being made, of course, Fire and Blood was not out yet. That didn't come for many years afterwards. But things like this to me is, I think, why he added that POV then in later. I guess it's not a point of view, but that character that we learn things through and we have to decipher in Fire and Blood. He drunkenly leans close to Sansa and says Varys the Spider pays in gold for trifles, and that Moon Boy has likely been his for years, which I don't doubt. This is a great person to have information from, and Moon Boy, who people don't really regard. Same idea of Dantos, it wouldn't surprise me. Sansa recognizes that Dantos is drunk again and thinks sadly of him as her poor Florian, the only ally she has left. And we really know that Dantos isn't an ally of Sansa. He's also being paid by Littlefinger. It's kind of going to just show that Sansa feels completely isolated. She feels like she has nobody she can turn to. And in a lot of ways, Sansa has deterred people from helping her. Like, for instance, Tyrion wanted to help her, but Sansa pushed him away because, well, she couldn't trust him. He's a Lannister, all that idea. If you want to know my full thoughts, go back to Sansa 3, of course. But even the people like the Hound, she's pushing away because he's this person that's not, you know, a stereotypical knight, and he's ugly to look at, and she's scared of him, even though the Hound is the person that saved her life. If she should have any faith in anyone, it should be the Hound, not Dantos. Sansa then asks if it is true that Stannis burned the Godswood at Storm's End. As we get into page 565, Dantos nodded that Stannis made a great pyre of the trees at Storm's End as an offering to his new god at the Red Priestess' urging. And this is another thing. Just think about how long, you know, trees at Storm's End had basically been a thing. It's this thing that, you know, Catelyn notes in her Renly's Peach chapter, is that Stannis had been building all the siege equipment and taking down all these trees outside of Storm's End that have probably stood for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it really just shows you what war does to the beauty of nature and of the world and even of cultures. But it also shows why people don't want Stannis to be king. If you're hearing that Stannis is burning trees and he's burning the new gods and their statues and he's doing all this stuff, that is a deep attack on your religion. That's another reason why Tyrion also uses religion to kind of mobilize the people against Stannis as well, as we'll see that really soon. Dantos claims Stannis had vowed to burn the great sept of Baelor if he takes the city, Sansa recalling the sept and her father's execution there, and she once had thought it very beautiful, but she told Dantos she wants it burned, which you can totally understand. That very traumatic event happened for Sansa there, but I'll say this. You see how all of the things Tyrion is doing are being shown through this Sansa chapter. And so what I really think about Sansa in her first 4 chapters of the book is that, yes, George is building up the character of Sansa, of course, for Storm of Swords, but in a lot of ways, Sansa's chapters are complementary chapters to Tyrion. It's the same idea as Sansa in the first book with Ned. She's a complementary character to that King's Landing plot, so that Ned doesn't have 20, 25 chapters. He has characters like Arya and Sansa to help lighten that load so we don't have a Ned chapter every other chapter. It's the same idea with Tyrion. Tyrion has a ton of chapters in this book, and Sansa can kind of foil some of that a little bit, like can kind of take away that we're not on Tyrion chapter here, Tyrion chapter there. We can have a Sansa chapter in there that can still get the effect of what you would do with a Tyrion chapter, just showing that all his planning is starting to, you know, pay off. And you see that really in this chapter, as even Dantos is noting that the great sept of Baelor might be burned by Stannis, which we know Stannis has not said at all. That was all made up by Tyrion. Dantos warned Sansa to be quiet because the gods will hear her, and Sansa said the gods would never hear her prayers. Dantos insisted they do, reminding her he was sent to her. It's Sansa very interesting. Like, she is always about being this character that, you know, believes in the gods, and she believes in the story tales. And it's so interesting because when we see Sansa with Dantos and Sansa with the Hound, we see Sansa and the way that she looks at the gods very differently. And this isn't to say that Sansa doesn't believe in the gods. It's that the gods never seem to answer Sansa's prayers. Sansa believes that there are gods. She says that when she's confronted by the Hound about this idea. But it's so interesting because I think what's so great about Sansa's character, it's similar to Catelyn in a lot of ways, is even in today's world, if you believe there's a god, if you believe there's something else, whatever you believe in personally, I think most people can relate to during a time of struggle, a time of loss, a time of, you know, sadness. When you see those things happening, you wonder, if there is a god, why do they let this kind of suffering happen? So, you know, for instance, think about all the atrocities going on in the world. Think about moments in history where Hundreds of thousands or millions of people have been killed for no reason. They were innocent people. If there was a God, why is there things like cancer that we just can't treat and people lose their lives way younger than they should? That's what Sansa is being confronted with in this chapter, and I think it's a really awesome talking point. I'm not the biggest person about learning about, like, say, religion and stories and all that, but that talking point has always fascinated me personally because I've seen a lot of experience with that idea. And so I really find it interesting that George, brings it up here, especially when you have Tyrion, bringing up the idea that Stannis can maybe burn the Sept of Baelor. But Sansa doesn't respond to Dantos really saying that he was sent, to help her and all this stuff, because Sansa says, what has Dantos really done? He hasn't gotten her home despite his promise. All Dantos has done is talk. He has done nothing to reassure Sansa that they are going to somehow escape. Dantos said he has spoken to a man who will hire a swift ship to take them to safety when the time is right. And at this point, if you're Sansa, you must be thinking, well, time is of the essence. I'm being abused every single day. I was almost killed. Stannis is right on the doorstep of sacking the city. When is the time going to be right? Isn't there no better time than right now? Sansa is one of the least priorities right now for characters like Tyrion, Cersei. They have inevitable, maybe their deaths coming soon. They're not really worried about Sansa, and that's what she argues to Dantos. But Dantos is a little bit more practical, just saying, how would they even get out? They could get out of the castle, like the Red Keep, but could they really get out of King's Landing? No. The city gates and the river are too tightly guarded, and the imp has closed off the river, of course, because you're preparing for war. There's no way you would be able to escape, especially as a highborn girl like Sansa. People would be asking questions. Sansa did note that the Blackwater Rush was nearly empty. Ferries withdrawn to the north bank and trading galleys fled or were seized and refitted for battle. That's another thing we kind of got this hinted by from Tyrion as well, is that Tyrion is taking any boats at King's Landing and repurposing them for the war effort. Only the king's war galleys remained, rowing up and down and exchanging arrows with Stannis' archers on the south shore. Stannis' vanguard had arrived 2 nights earlier. Their tents and banners were visible from the city. It's just enough to spark a little bit of fear into King's Landing, that impending attack that is there. And so if you're a common person living in King's Landing, all you got to do is go look across and you see all these men getting ready to take your city. And for a lot of them, they will remember the sack of King's Landing. It's not all that long ago. The show makes it feel like it's so long ago because they aged up a lot of the characters. So characters like Ned and Catelyn are far younger in the book than they are shown to be in the show. And so sometimes people just forget, like, this didn't happen all that long ago. There's a lot of people from King's Landing that will have remembered the sack of King's Landing when the Lannisters came. Sansa had heard that Stannis had about 5,000 men, roughly equal to the Gold Cloaks in the city. So already, this force that has shown up that isn't even, most of Stannis' strength, has about as much men as, well, Tyrion and the Lannisters have as well. Sansa noted that the vanguard banners included Fossaway, Estermont, and Florent sigils. Their commander was Sir Gyrd Morgan, and whose standard bore a flying crow on a storm green field. The pale yellow banners with the burning heart of the Lord of Light R'hllor worried the city, as Dantos told Sansa that Stannis' host size does not matter so long as they remain on the far side of the river, because Stannis cannot cross without ships. And so just introducing that idea of what's going to be so pivotal for the Battle of the Blackwater is Stannis needs to cross. So for Stannis to be able to attack the city, he needs his fleet to beat Joffrey's fleet. And right now, that doesn't even seem to be a question. Stannis' fleet is far superior to Joffrey's. And so we'll just have to see how that plays out as we get into page 566. Dantos reminded Sansa that Stannis still needed ships to cross, and saying his fleet would have to sail a long way and perhaps storms might sweep them off. Now, I would say you could argue that if it was a further travel, but going from Storm's End to King's Landing is not all that far. It's not that big of a risk. Say, for instance, Victarion going all the way to Marine, much bigger journey, a lot easier to lose a bunch of ships. Here, it's not the same. He urged her to be patient, promising his friend would arrange a ship to take her away when the time was right. Sansa, however, was consumed with fear. Nightmares of the riot when Myrcella had sailed still haunted her, and she remembered the Hound saving her from the mob. Everything is kind of coming to a head for Sansa. She has this traumatic event. She's about to have her period, and she's already probably feeling the effects of that. I probably should know more on this, but I don't know a ton about women and their periods and stuff like that. So I'm going to come off as very ignorant probably in this chapter, but that's me. I don't know a ton about that information. So I'm sorry for my ladies watching this. I'll try my best. And you just have a lot of things going on for Sansa. You know, she's being abused by Joffrey, by Cersei, by really everybody at King's Landing. You have a war that she's uncertain on what her fate would be. So even if Stannis won, what is Sansa's fate? Like, is Stannis going to kill Sansa? Is she going to be used the way she's heard other women be used during a sack? Who knows? I mean, think about, for instance, the innocents that died the last time there was a sack. Think about Elia. She was of no real threat, and she was killed all of the same. So, same idea. She noted how the whole city was terrified. People hid behind locked doors, knowing that if King's Landing fell, there would be no mercy. And Sansa kind of throws in a remark that I think a lot of people that don't like Sansa also would pick up on. Sansa kind of says, they hide in their houses, hoping that that's going to protect them, and it's really not going to. One thing I do wonder, though, if Stannis was to sack the city, Stannis is a person that does not like things done that happen during a sack, sexual assault, stealing, all that kind of stuff. Stannis is very much against those things. I wonder what would have happened if Stannis had actually won in terms of the sack of King's Landing. Like, would it actually have gone down, or would have people have been fearful of what Stannis would have done to people that did that? I do wonder, like, how that all would have gone down, because George puts a lot of emphasis on men are beasts when it comes to war and the cruel things they'll do, and then they'll go back to a normal life of, like, farming. I do wonder how George would have, like, written a sack of King's Landing from Stannis actually winning. But Sansa also noted that it's very different, because when you think about the sack of King's Landing the first time, it was a force that was allowed to come into the castle. They hadn't fought any of that kind of stuff, and they still were brutally, assaulted. Homes were destroyed, robbery, all this stuff by the Lannisters. Here, they were openly fighting their attackers, so you couldn't expect anything, really. You couldn't expect any mercy. So I think that was another interesting thing that Sansa brings up, and a little bit of that intelligence that Sansa can have. Dantos babbled about being lucky he was no longer a knight, free from manning the walls and potentially dying. Sansa snapped that Joffrey might knight him again for being such a fool, but Dantos only chuckled, calling her clever. Sansa then responds saying that everybody thinks she's stupid, like for instance Cersei, but Dantos says that's actually a good thing, because then, all the great players, Cersei, Tyrion, Varys, they all spy on each other, but they wouldn't pay Sansa near as much any mind if they thought her to be, dumb. Like, for instance, Lady Tanda's daughter, Lawless. Which is completely true. Sansa has not shown herself to be a player of the Game of Thrones, so nobody really takes that much interest in her, and that's a good thing. You want her to kind of be at the back of everyone's mind right now. And unfortunately, that's not going to necessarily happen because, she has her period. That kind of gets her in trouble with Cersei, and we see all that comes down. But Dantos is right for the most part. As Dantos grows even more drunk from the wine, he begged Sansa for a kiss. She gave him one on the cheek, holding back tears as she wished him good night, knowing she had been weeping too often of late. Like I said, Sansa is going through a lot stress-wise, everything going on around her. She's dealing with the emotions when it comes to her first period, even though she doesn't know that that's about to happen yet. Like, she's going to bleed at some point in this chapter. She just doesn't truly grasp everything that's going on. As we get into page 567, the drawbridge of Tumager's Holdfast was left unguarded, as most gold cloaks had been moved to the walls and the Kingsguard were occupied elsewhere. They had better things to do than to guard a drawbridge which seemed safe at the moment. Sansa was free to move about the castle, but felt trapped no matter where she went. She could not face her bedchamber, instead climbed up to the roof. And that's the other thing. Sansa, she might have freedom of the castle, but it still feels like a prison, just a very big prison. And there's nothing really to look forward to. Right now you're on the edge of a war, of a siege. There's nothing you really can do about that. It's what a lot of people in King's Landing would feel, the anxiousness of the battle to come. From above, she saw the Red Keep, the mazes of streets, the Black River, the bay, and countless fires burning across the city. She saw it all. Soldiers swarmed the walls with torches, manned the hoardings, and near the mud gate she spotted 3 massive catapults towering 20 feet above the wall. Despite the view, she was overwhelmed by fear, clutched her belly, and nearly fell before being caught by a sudden shadow. Now, I think this is interesting, is you see her going out to the roof, and she thinks that this is going to be something that might help her calm down. But if anything, it makes her more fearful, because when you have such a great view, you can see everything that's to come. You see the battle, you see where all these men are lined up and preparing. You know, at any day, it could be the end of your life, more or less. And also for Sansa, she's deeply depressed, and she might even be suicidal, which we have seen she has suicidal thoughts in past chapters, so I would say she is at least considering it. She's also dealing with the period as well, which is, having its effects. So she is once again saved by the Hound from falling. Strong hands steadied her, as it was Sandor Clegane, the Hound. She cried for him to let go, insisting she wasn't going to fall, only startled. The Hound mocked her, asking if the little bird thought she had wings or meant to be crippled like Bran. The Hound knows that Sansa is in a deep emotional place, and so he does joke around that deep idea, but it's a tough one. The Hound is somebody that does not exactly come off as the nicest person in the world, and that's kind of why we love him in a lot of ways. He accused her of being afraid of him still, reminding her how glad she had been to see his face during the riot, but now she can't even look at his face anymore. And she seems ungrateful for the Hound's, helping her and saving her life and all this stuff. But Sansa hasn't really shown any of that to Sandor. And it's a little bit of the bitterness, right? The Hound feels like, because of his appearance, because of the person that he is, Sansa's not able to even connect with the Hound at all. And so the Hound and I think Tyrion are very fascinating characters, because in a lot of ways, I think they are two faces of like the same coin. Whereas Tyrion feels he's unlovable because of his experiences with Tysha and because of his physical condition, all that kind of stuff. The Hound is in the same way, but for different reasons, because of how awful he looks and how brutal he is as a person, that in a lot of ways he's kind of given up on love, of acceptance of those things. And so he kind of leans into his persona as a dog, as the Hound. And for Tyrion, it's the same way. He kind of leans into being the imp and the evil, lordling or whatever. And so you see both of those characters are very similar in a lot of ways. And you see how that's impacted on a character like Sansa. Sansa recalls how vivid the mob's howls, being struck by a stone, grabbed by a man, and nearly pulled from her horse before the Hound had saved her, cutting off the man's hand. As we get into page 568, Sansa kind of remembers how she was going to die, but the man's fingers twitched and he shrieked. Then another man shoved her back into the saddle, being the Hound. So you see that during this whole time, Sansa is the queen to be. She should be a very valuable person. We saw during that riot that only the Hound cared about her. Nobody else seemed to care. Cersei was worried about Joffrey. Tyrion was worried about, everybody, because he's the only competent person here. And Sansa almost gets left behind and is nearly killed, would have had worse things done to her. Maybe could have even been kidnapped by Varys, if you believe Varys was orchestrating the whole thing and he took Tyrick. Maybe he was planning to also take Sansa. That's an interesting idea I hadn't really thought of until this point of recording the video, but it's an idea. She remembers the garlicky-breathed attacker laying on the ground, bleeding from the stump of his arm, and others attackers stood nearby with clubs. The Hound leapt at them, his sword a blur that trailed a red mist. The attackers broke and ran, and he laughed. The Hound is somebody that, even though there might have been all these different people, and they're so desperate, they're not willing to die. When they see the Hound and how big he is, how muscly he is, the armor he has, his helmet, even then, they're not that desperate, and so they run away. And you see that. And we're really going to get a little bit about Varys' riddle that he gives to Tyrion about power. And you're going to see that here with the Hound. The Hound really intensifies the idea of the person with the sword and skill is the person really in power. We know that's not necessarily the case, but the Hound is also going to throw in his own ideology as well. Sansa forced herself to look at his face, noting the scars and the anger in his eyes, and thanked him haltingly for saving her. The Hound dismissed her praise, saying a dog needs no courage to chase rats, and that he enjoys killing. He mocked the idea of knightly honor. So even Sansa, she's gotten the courage to try and apologize to the Hound and, thank him for everything that he's done. The Hound just kind of throws it back in her face. He knows that this is all a farce because Sansa still doesn't really care about him and doesn't like him like she loves all these other knights like Loras, for instance. So the Hound is basically just stating that. Sansa is doing her rehearsed lines, And the Hound is making fun of that. And so you understand from both sides that Sansa's trying to be kind, trying to be the woman that her mother taught her to be. The Hound is being who he is. He's being the person he is. He's not hiding anything. The fact that he comes out and says, I like killing. Nobody else in the series will say something like that. The Hound likes killing in a lot of ways because I think it is a way of getting his anger out and in a lot of ways asserting power over people. Now, I think to a degree, the Hound doesn't necessarily like killing, but he likes the feeling that comes from it. Think about what we're going to see with the Hound in the future of the series, and as he goes into A Feast for Crows specifically, and we assume he's the Gravedigger character, it kind of shows that, the Hound didn't like killing. He liked that feeling because he felt so hollow. He felt so broken as an individual, and that's who he had to be. And when he was shown an alternative route, we'll have to see how that goes. Hopefully we will see the Hound again, and hopefully he's a transformed individual, but we'll just have to see. He referenced Eddard Stark's execution and taunted her about it, then laid the edge of his longsword against her neck under the ear. The Hound is really trying to prove the idea that the person that has the sword has the power. That is not the case, and we know that. Because it's people that all these men swear their swords to. That is the person who has the power. So for instance, Joffrey technically has power over the Hound until the Hound reaches his breaking point. And so this is kind of like a foreshadowing moment to that. The Hound is showing that he is the person in control and in power. And so when he disobeys Joffrey, he disobeys Tyrion and leaves, this is like the foreshadowing to that moment. He's his own man. Nobody has power over him. There's nobody that he should fear. He told her he had killed many people, lords, rich men, knights, women, and children, calling them all meat, and himself the butcher. It's a horrible thing that he says, killing innocents and all this other stuff. And it's one of those reasons that makes the Hound so interesting, because he's a character that I think a lot of people, and myself included, like, especially as we get into A Storm of Swords and we see him with Arya and, for instance, that whole arc there. It's so interesting because on one hand, the Hound does horrible actions like that. He kills Micah, for instance. But on the other hand, he's willing to help Sansa. He's willing to save her life multiple times. And so you see that here. He spat at her feet, lifted the sword from her throat, and declared that as long as he had his sword, there was no man on earth he needed fear. As we get into page 569, Sansa thought of Sandor's fear of fire, realizing he was brave with steel but not flame. She kept quiet, knowing better than to taunt him, and she also brings up being afraid of the mountain because that's where the whole thing of being afraid of fire comes from. But she also compares it, you're looking around, this is a battlefield that right now is on fire, and it's going to even get worse with the wildfire and all that, but it's like a prelude to the fire that is to come. She compared him to a savage dog in her mind, dangerous, cruel, yet fiercely protective of his masters. And again, that goes to show the Hound is not the person in power, necessarily, until he breaks from that. She asked if he feared the men across the river. He replied, all this burning was cowardice, and only cowards fought with fire. We know that the Hound fears fire, and he's going to have to be confronted with that when the Battle of Blackwater starts. Sansa said Stannis was no coward, but Sandor countered he was not Robert either, as Robert would have never let a river stop him. And I think it's kind of unfair, for one, given the fact that, Stannis is waiting for his ships, and then he's going to attack. But he's also right in terms of, Robert was somebody that would command from the front. He would be in the midst of all of his men fighting. He wasn't somebody that was like Tywin or Stannis who commanded the battlefield from kind of the back, seeing everything playing out in front of him and reacting to it. That's never who Robert was. When she asked what he'd do if Stannis crossed, Sandor asked, fight, kill, and maybe die. She asked if he feared the gods sending him to hell for his evil, but he laughed and mocked the idea of evil or gods. He challenged her fear, saying if gods exist, they made the weak for the strong to use sheep for wolves. But he also brings up things like, Tyrion. If there were a god, why would they make Tyrion, with all the disabilities that he has and the appearance that he has and how he's discriminated against, why would there be a god if that was the case? If Sandor, who has been doing all these awful crimes, all this stuff, if there was a god, why does that god not strike the Hound down for everything that he's done? That's what the Hound is more or less saying to Sansa, and Sansa's now on the back foot. Whereas before, she was challenging the gods and she was kind of doubting them. Now, when she's faced with the Hound, she's defending them. She is sticking up for the gods more or less. Sansa clung to her idea that true knights protect the weak, but Sandor dismissed it, saying, "There are no true knights, only strong arms and sharp steel." And Sandor, I think, is correct to a large extent. True knights are pretty much gone at this point from Westeros. And yes, there are a few, and people that should be knights that aren't. The title of being a knight means nothing in terms of you as a person. And in reality, what a knight means now is that you're upper class from like a sellsword, or you have some prestige to your name, but it doesn't mean that you're a good person. Gregor is a knight. A lot of the men that are Lannisters are knights, and think about all the crimes that happen in the Riverlands. Think about the people in King's Landing that are knights. They don't defend Sansa when she's being abused. Think about the Kingsguard. That's everything that the Hound is trying to tell Sansa that she's still not really gotten it through her head on. And we get one of the best quotes, I think, of this book. He tells her that the world was awful, not him, and sent her away with scorn. Afraid, she fled, but deep down wished Dantos had a fraction of the Hound's ferocity. She wishes that the Hound stood on business more and actually told her the truth and things like that. And she wishes that she had a fierce person to back her like the Hound, not Dantos. And I think that's the whole point of this. But another thing I want to point out, it's a lot of, with the Hound, the idea of nurture versus nature. So the idea of the way that the Hound grew up has shaped the person that he's become. Or was he always like this? So no matter how he grew up, was he always going to be this brutal, huge man that's, like this? It's a lot of kind of what the Hound is saying here. The world is awful, and it crafts awful people. She reassured herself that there must be gods and true knights, and not all stories could be lies. And once again, Sansa has not learned from all these mistakes and all these stories and everything that's happened to her. That night she dreamed of the riot again, the mob as a beast with 1,000 faces, shrieking and dragging her down. She begged for mercy, calling on Dantos, her family, and even heroes from the songs, but none came. Again, just backing up the idea that there are no true knights, and that the person that actually saved her was the Hound. He's not no true knight. Women attacked her like weasels, pinching, kicking her belly, shattering her teeth. And in the dream, a knife stabbed into her belly again and again until she was left only in bloody ribbons. And this is going to lead then to her waking up and realizing she is on her period, she's having blood all over the place, and that she has to act quickly. As we get into page 570, Sansa woke to pale morning light but felt sick and unrested. She discovered something sticky on her thighs, and when she threw back the blanket, she saw blood, thinking her dream had come true. Terrified, she recalled knives ripping her in her dream and scrambled away naked and bloody, breathing raggedly. The realization struck. She had begun her flowering. She whimpered no over and over, not wanting it to happen. And this is what Sansa's realizing. Sansa is not exactly afraid of her flowering or being able to birth children now. She's more scared because now this opens the door to her marrying Joffrey. Before it had been a betrothal. Sansa was not old enough to have a wedding yet because, well, she couldn't have children. And so this is the go that, okay, Joffrey and Sansa could be married tomorrow. Even though we're in the middle of a war, if the Lannisters wanted to cement that relationship before Joffrey died and try to get an heir on Sansa, they could do so. And that's the horror and all those emotions that Sansa is feeling. In a panic, she washed herself in the basin until the water turned pink, fearing the maids would know. Remembering the bedclothes, she rushed back and saw the blood stain. Desperate to hide it, she cut the sheet with a knife. She burned the sheet, blanket, and part of the featherbed in her fireplace, filling the room with smoke. And obviously this is going to have a lot of attention on it. You start smelling smoke inside of the castle, and maids eventually are going to come in, and they're going to see this awful state. Her maids burst in, pulling her away as she struggled with the mattress. Despite her efforts, the blood returned, betraying her to Joffrey as a banner of crimson. The servants removed the burnt bedding, cleared smoke, and prepared a tub. Women bathed her, washed her hair, and gave her a cloth to wear between her legs, looking at her strangely as they did. Because all these people are wondering, like, why is Sansa doing this? It's just her flowering. It's not all this huge big deal where she needs to hide it and all this stuff. They don't understand how awful it is to have to possibly marry Joffrey. But we also know that all these servants are spying on her for Cersei, so we also know that this is going to go directly to Cersei as we get into page 571. After her panic, Sansa grew calm but ashamed of her folly. Smoke had ruined most of her clothes as a maid brought her green wool shift to wear. Her shoes survived the fire, so she would not need to go barefoot before the queen. And so this is the big part of it. Sansa, in a lot of ways, kind of looks up to Cersei. A lot of that's kind of worn off because of book 1, but she still looks up to Cersei being this womanly figure that she should strive to be. And now she's going to the queen in somebody else's clothes that are not all that fancy. She looks a mess given her actions. Sansa was brought to Queen Cersei, who was breaking her fast with porridge, honey, milk, eggs, and fried fish, which sounds fantastic, by the way. I'm super hungry recording this. One of the better descriptions of food by George. Cersei invited her to eat, but Sansa declined. Her stomach knotted. In terms of just what's going on with her period, in terms of, I would say, nervousness and anxiousness that she's feeling. I'm somebody personally that when I'm very anxious, or even in times of like stress in terms of like loss, so maybe when I lost my grandfather, my grandmother, I'm prone to not eating a lot, and then maybe in turn then eating a bunch. So I can definitely relate to Sansa here. The queen asked about the fire, and Sansa admitted the blood had frightened her, which Sansa is kind of using as a lie to kind of cover up what she was really feeling. But I also do think like Sansa is somebody that maybe she's been prepared for this, but at the same time, could you ever be prepared from having blood come out of you, the feelings you're having? I do think to a certain degree Sansa also had a stark reaction because of her dream and the way that the flowering is not as flowery. Cersei explains the blood was the seal of womanhood and that Catelyn should have prepared her, which I believe Catelyn did. Sansa is just trying to use this as kind of like a scapegoat, more or less. Sansa said her mother had told her, but she thought it would be different, less messy and more magical. And unfortunately, this serves as really Sansa's whole ideology. Sansa believes the world to be this very magical, flowery place, but in reality, it's a very dark, messy, morally corrupt world. Cersei laughed, saying childbirth was worse, and life was 9 parts messy to 1 part magic. She told Sansa she was a woman now, and asked if she knew what it meant. Sansa answered, almost in a kind of depressed tone, that it meant she was fit to be wed, bedded, and bear children for the king. Cersei, in a lot of ways, I think has a lot of sympathy for Sansa in this moment, just because Cersei, I think, sees herself in Sansa quite a lot, given the fact that she's being forced now to marry somebody that she doesn't really like all that much. Cersei can see and visualize a lot of her younger life onto Sansa, and in a lot of ways, I don't mean that like Cersei cares about Sansa, but it more is like a pity party for how hard Cersei's life was. That's kind of how I look at it. Cersei is always somebody that is very selfish, and she thinks about everything that happens to her. And so I think that's why more or less this comes off the way it's going to. Cersei smiled wryly, acknowledging Sansa no longer found that enticing, and said Joffrey had always been difficult. She recalled laboring a day and a half to deliver him, screaming so loudly she fancied Robert might have heard her in the King's Wood. Robert had not been present. He went hunting whenever she went into labor. When he returned, he brought pelts or stag heads and gave him a baby. What's so interesting is we really don't get a lot of like one-on-one time with Cersei. And so when you finally do with Sansa, it's great because we get more into Cersei's backstory. We get more into how awful of a husband Robert was. Robert wasn't even there for his wife bearing, well, not exactly his children, but in his eyes, his children. He went off to go hunting. It shows how bad of a husband and a person Robert was, especially in his later years. When Sansa is shocked by this, Cersei also says that she didn't actually want him to be there anyway, as she had Pycelle, midwives, and her brother, Jaime. When told he could not enter, Jaime had smiled and asked who would keep him out. Again, going back to the idea of the person with the power, with a sword, a great fighter, has power. More or less going back to the Hound's idea. As we get into page 572, Cersei warned that Joffrey would show Sansa no devotion and that she could blame her sister if she weren't dead. Which is interesting because Sansa did blame her sister back in those chapters in A Game of Thrones, and still to some degree she does harbor some of that. But Joffrey cannot forget the trident and shames Sansa in turn. It shows how much of an asshole Joffrey is, just because, Sansa saw him being beaten down by Arya more or less in a dire wolf, all of a sudden that justifies Joffrey treating Sansa like crap? I don't think so, Cersei. Cersei believes Sansa is stronger than she seems and expects her to survive some humiliation, given that she had. Again, it's Cersei seeing a lot in Sansa. In a lot of ways, it's a pity party. Think about the whole story she just told. Sansa didn't ask about Cersei and Robert and all their, issues in their marriage, but Cersei brought it up anyway. Cersei said Sansa may never love the king, but she will love his children. And I think that's true. I think that even if you hate the person you're with, you will love your children, or at least you should. I think all mothers love their children, or at least good mothers anyway. At least love their children and try their best for their children. I think the same is true for Sansa. Now, Cersei is a little different. I think Cersei likes her children because they're extensions of herself. But I don't know. That's me diving into some stuff we'll talk a lot more about in A Feast for Crows. Sansa then, giving a half-hearted response, says she loved his grace with all her heart. The queen sighed and advised Sansa to learn new lies quickly, warning that Lord Stannis would not like her declaration. And even Cersei is seeing how bleak the situation is. They have far fewer men than Stannis does. It's looking terrible right now. Tywin is not on his way to the capital in her eyes. We know he is, but Cersei doesn't know that. Cersei doesn't know all the information that maybe as a person that has read the series already knows. Sansa mentioned the new High Septon's claim that the gods will not permit Stannis to win because Joffrey is the rightful king. And this gives Cersei a little bit of happiness because, she wants people to believe that Joffrey is the true-born son and heir. But Cersei recalled Robert's preference for being loved and his fondness for smiles and cheers, which drove him to friends and whores. Another thing we get with the idea of Robert as a person, we see from Cersei's perspective a lot of things that make her a little bit more sympathetic, just based on the idea that Robert just avoided tense situations. Think about how he dies. Think about why Robert goes hunting. Because Ned and the Lannisters are having all this conflict and he goes and hides. Same idea here. Cersei compared Tyrion to Robert, saying her brother had the same need to be loved. And we know what Cersei's working on in the background with the whole plot of who is Tyrion's actual lover, and Cersei gets it wrong, of course, but she's already got that going on in her mind. And so I do think this, though, is Tyrion's big weakness, and what drives him to make so many bad decisions is his feeling of needing to be loved. And so Cersei is right. That is a weakness of Tyrion, even if it's been planted in him because of everything going on. It's totally understandable the way Tyrion feels, but Cersei is right. In terms of like politics and trying to get power over your brother, she is right. Sansa replied that everyone wants to be loved, and I agree that this is totally true. Most people in the world, to some degree, want to be felt like they're loved. It doesn't even, it doesn't matter if you're looking at the most stoic man who never shows emotion or any of those things. Deep down, everyone wants to be loved, and that is just the truth. But Cersei quipped that flowering hadn't made Sansa any brighter, again putting Sansa down for literally no reason. Sansa is completely right. Cersei offered a piece of womanly wisdom. Love is poison, sweet but deadly. And I will say this, Cersei's right again. Love is something that can be so great. It can be so great, and you can have your best moments of your life. Like I multiple times, if somebody's ever asked me, like, what are like the 5 best moments of your life? And I look at like 2 or 3 of them, and I think about the times that I've been in love, with somebody or whatever. But the worst moments of your life can be when you lose that love. So whether it's, you lose a family member, you lose your girlfriend, you lose, your wife, maybe you get divorced or any of those things. Love is sweet, but it can also be deadly. And that's just the truth. So Cersei and Sansa are right in this chapter. But what Cersei is thinking about is just like, oh, I got to use things against people. And Sansa is coming at it more of like a realistic approach. People want to feel loved. That's just the truth. And so that gets us to the end of the chapter. I personally believe this is Sansa's best chapter of the first 4. I think this one does the perfect amount of character work for Sansa, interesting plot points in terms of building off of Tyrion's last chapter and seeing all the chess pieces for the Battle of the Blackwater. Cersei and Sansa's conversation at the end of the chapter is fantastic. Her conversation with the Hound is fantastic. This is just a good chapter for Sansa. I don't think Sansa, especially at this point of the book, has any standout chapters. Like, I'd probably put this in maybe the middle or maybe the upper middle section of my ranking. But yeah, good chatter for Sansa. I hope you guys all enjoyed. I hope you guys are all excited for the Battle of the Blackwater and the things to come. And yeah, I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.